The ice in Nathaniel's glass rattled when the plane door closed. First class on the Orlando to New York flight smelled like leather seats and somebody's expensive perfume. Vanessa was beside him, barefoot already, scrolling through rooftop restaurants on her phone. Then the voice came from the aisle. "Good afternoon. Welcome aboard." Nathaniel looked up. Imani stood there in a navy blue flight attendant uniform, one hand resting on the drink cart, her wedding ring gone. For a second, nobody moved. Vanessa smiled politely. "Can I get champagne?" Imani nodded and wrote something on her notepad. Then she looked at Nathaniel. "And for you?" she asked quietly. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Vanessa frowned. "Wait, you know her?" Nathaniel stared at the folded note sticking out of his jacket pocket. "Don't forget your charger. You always forget your charger." "That's my wife," he said. Imani did not blink. She just picked up the champagne glass and said, "You should have told her that before we boarded." Welcome to Mr. Kingswell Stories, where powerful life lessons come through unforgettable stories about love, betrayal, family, and second chances. If you're new here, subscribe and join us for more stories that make you think differently about life. And before we begin, tell me in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. Nathaniel could not stop staring at Imani. The first-class cabin on the flight from Orlando to New York suddenly felt too small, too bright. The soft jazz playing through the speakers sounded wrong somehow, like it belonged in somebody else's life. Imani stood in the aisle beside the drink cart in her navy blue uniform, her hair pulled back neatly, her face calm in a way that made Nathaniel's chest tighten. Vanessa looked between them. "What do you mean, your wife?" Nobody answered right away. A flight attendant farther down the aisle was helping an older man lift his suitcase into the overhead bin. Somebody across from them opened a laptop. A woman 2 rows back laughed at something on her phone. The world kept moving. Nathaniel felt like it had stopped. Imani picked up the champagne glass with one hand and set it carefully on Vanessa's tray table. "Here you go." Vanessa didn't touch it. She was still staring at Nathaniel. "You told me you were separated." Nathaniel swallowed. His mouth had gone dry. "We are." Basically, Imani let out a small breath through her nose, not a laugh. "Something worse." "Basically," she repeated. Nathaniel looked up at her. Really looked. There was no wedding ring on her hand. He had noticed it the second she reached for the glass, but his brain had refused to accept it. The skin on her finger looked pale where the ring used to sit. Vanessa turned in her seat. "Nathaniel, I was going to tell you." "When?" Vanessa snapped. "After we landed?" A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper just enough to see over the top of it. Nathaniel leaned toward Vanessa, lowering his voice. "Please, not right now." "Oh, now you want privacy." Imani looked down at the small notepad in her hand and wrote something on it, like she couldn't hear any of this, like he was just another difficult passenger. But Nathaniel knew her. He knew the tiny muscle that jumped in her jaw when she was hurt and trying not to show it. He knew the way she pressed her lips together when she was holding herself together by force. He knew she was angry. No, not angry. Past angry. "Sir," she said evenly, without looking at him, "would you still like sparkling water?" The way she said "sir" nearly broke him. Imani. She finally looked at him. Professional, polite, distant. "Would you like sparkling water?" Vanessa's face changed then. Not just shock anymore. Embarrassment. The kind that turns your cheeks hot and makes you realize you have been standing in the middle of somebody else's marriage without even understanding the shape of it. "You said you were living separate lives," Vanessa said quietly. Nathaniel rubbed a hand over his face. "We have been." "No," Vanessa said. "No, don't do that." The edge in her voice made the woman in the seat behind them glance up from her magazine. "You told me the marriage was over." Nathaniel had said that in hotel bars, in late-night phone calls, in text messages sent from conference rooms and airport lounges. It had been easier to say that than the truth. The truth was that he had never left, because leaving would have required a choice, and Nathaniel had spent months trying to avoid making one. He wanted Vanessa because she made him feel young and important and admired. He wanted Imani because she knew him before he became somebody people shook hands with and took pictures beside. Vanessa knew the man in the tailored suits. Imani knew the boy who used to sit in his car outside her house because he didn't want to go home. "You lied to me," Vanessa said. Nathaniel looked down. Across the aisle, The newspaper folded slowly. The whole cabin could feel it now. The tension, the shame, the ugly private thing happening in public. Imani turned slightly, like she was about to move on to the next row. Then Nathaniel saw it. The folded note sticking out of his jacket pocket. He reached for it without thinking. "Don't forget your charger. You always forget your charger." Her handwriting, neat, familiar, slightly slanted. His throat tightened. Vanessa followed his eyes. "What is that?" He didn't answer. Imani did. "I left him a note this morning," she said softly. Vanessa stared at her. "You knew?" Imani held her gaze for a second. "I knew enough." Vanessa looked back at Nathaniel like she had never seen him before. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Vanessa unbuckled her seatbelt. "Nathaniel, I am not doing this." "Vanessa, wait." "No." She grabbed her purse from under the seat so fast, the strap caught on the armrest. "You should have told me the truth." "I was going to." "Stop saying that." Her voice cracked on the last word. Not because she loved him, because nobody likes finding out they have been lied to. Nobody likes realizing they have been standing in somebody else's damage. The flight attendant near the front looked over. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" Vanessa shook her head once. Then she looked at Imani. For a second, something passed between them. Not friendship, not forgiveness. Just the awful understanding of two women who suddenly realized they had both been listening to the same man tell different stories. "I'm sorry," Vanessa said quietly. Imani looked surprised. Then she nodded once. "So am I." Vanessa picked up her bag and walked off the plane. Nathaniel watched her go. The cabin door was still open. People were still boarding. Somewhere behind him, somebody asked if seat 4C was by the window, but all he could hear was his own breathing. Then Imani set the glass of sparkling water down on his tray table. The ice cubes clinked softly. "You always get headaches when you drink before a flight," she said. Nathaniel looked up at her. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this. Please don't hate me. Please still know me." But none of them felt big enough. "Imani, how are you here?" For the first time, something flickered across her face. Pain. Then it was gone. "Funny," she said quietly. "I was about to ask you the same thing. 4 houses, that was all that separated them growing up. 4 houses on the same cracked street in Paramore, where the sidewalks buckled from old tree roots and every summer smelled like hot pavement, cut grass, and somebody grilling chicken before the sun went down. Imani's house sat near the corner, white paint peeling off the porch rails, wind chimes hanging by the front door. Her grandmother, Loretta Turner, in the same folding chair every evening with a bowl in her lap, shelling peas or snapping green beans while she watched the neighborhood like it belonged to her. Maybe it did. Nathaniel used to ride his bike past after Little League practice. His shirt stuck to his back, dirt on his knees. "Boy," Loretta would yell from the porch, "slow down before you break your neck." Nathaniel always smiled when she said it. Nobody yelled like that at his house. At Nathaniel's house, everything was quiet. Too quiet. His father sold insurance and wore a tie even on Saturdays. His mother kept the house spotless and smiled all the time, but the smile never quite reached her eyes. The television stayed low. Doors closed softly. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed very hard either. At dinner, Nathaniel's father asked the same questions every night. How was school? Fine. How was practice? Fine. Then silence. One night, when Nathaniel was 12, he accidentally knocked over a glass of sweet tea at dinner. The glass shattered across the table. His father looked at him like he had done it on purpose. "For once," he said sharply, "can you pay attention to what you're doing?" Nathaniel froze. His mother stood up quietly and grabbed paper towels, but she didn't say anything. Nobody ever said anything. 10 minutes later, Nathaniel was sitting on the curb outside with his bike beside him, staring down at the cracked concrete. Then he heard a screen door slam. Imani came jogging down the sidewalk in socks. "You coming?" she asked. He looked up. "Coming where?" "Dinner." He blinked. "What?" "My grandmother said if you're going to sit out here looking miserable, you might as well do it while eating." Nathaniel followed her. The second he stepped inside Imani's house, it hit him. The smell. Fried chicken. Cornbread. Onions cooking somewhere in the kitchen. Frankie Beverly, playing from the radio, people talking over each other, Imani's aunt arguing with her cousin over a card game, her mother standing at the stove in blue scrubs from the hospital, her father laughing so hard at something on TV, he nearly spilled his drink. Nobody looked embarrassed to be loud. Nobody looked afraid to take up space. Loretta pointed toward the table. "Sit down, baby." Nathaniel sat. Then somebody handed him a plate before he could even ask. After that, he started coming over all the time. At first, twice a week. Then, 4 times. Eventually, people stopped asking why he was there. By the time he was 14, there was always a place for him at the table. Imani liked him because he listened, really listened. Not the fake kind where somebody waits for their turn to talk. The real kind. When she was 15, she came home from school and found him sitting on the hood of his old Honda in front of her house. She threw her backpack into the passenger seat and climbed up beside him. "What happened?" he asked. She looked away. Nothing. "Imani." She crossed her arms. The girls at school were talking. About what? She shrugged, even though her throat already hurt. "My skin, my hair." She laughed once, bitter and embarrassed. One of them said, "I looked like I belonged in some old picture from the 70s. Nathaniel stared at her. "That's stupid. You don't have to say that. I'm serious." She looked down at her hands. "They act like if you don't look a certain way, you don't matter." Nathaniel was quiet for a second. Then he said, "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think they say stuff like that because they need somebody else to feel small." She looked at him. "You don't think there's something wrong with me?" He almost looked offended. "Imani, there is not one thing wrong with you." Nobody had ever said it like that before. Not because they were trying to make her feel better, because they believed it. Years later, she would still remember the way he looked at her in that moment. Like he saw her, really saw her. She tried to do the same for him. The summer after graduation, they spent half their nights sitting on the hood of that same Honda in the parking lot behind a 24-hour diner near Orange Blossom Trail. Nathaniel had just gotten another rejection email, an internship he wanted. Gone. He shut his phone off and threw it onto the dashboard. "I'm never going to be enough," he said. Imani looked at him. The neon open sign from the diner glowed red across his face. "You know what your problem is?" He let out a humorless laugh. "I have several. Be specific." "You spend so much time trying to prove yourself to everybody else," she said quietly, "that you don't even notice somebody already chose you." Nathaniel frowned. "What are you talking about?" Imani's heart was pounding so hard she thought she might pass out. For years she had waited for him to figure it out, waited for him to stop looking everywhere else for proof that he mattered. She was tired of waiting, so she leaned forward and kissed him. For 1 second, he didn't move. Then his hand came up to her face like he was scared she might disappear. When she pulled back, they just stared at each other. "You mean that?" he asked quietly. Imani laughed because she was suddenly crying and embarrassed and relieved all at once. "No, Nathaniel," she said. "I just kiss all my friends in diner parking lots." He laughed then, a real laugh, the kind that made him look younger, the kind that made her think maybe they would be okay. By the time they were 25, nobody in Orlando could remember a time when Imani and Nathaniel were not together. People said things like, "If those two don't make it, nobody will." Even Loretta used to smile when she looked at them. "That boy loved you since he was too dumb to know it," she told Imani once. Imani believed it. Nathaniel did too. Which was why, years later, sitting alone in first class with a glass of untouched sparkling water in front of him, he could not stop asking himself one terrible question. When had he become the kind of man who could lose her? Nathaniel cried before Imani even reached the end of the aisle. The church on the west side of Orlando was small and warm and packed with people fanning themselves with folded programs because the air conditioning had stopped working halfway through the ceremony. Loretta sat in the front row in a lavender suit, dabbing her eyes with a tissue and pretending she wasn't crying. Imani wore her mother's veil. Nathaniel stood at the altar in a dark gray suit, looking like he could barely breathe. The second he saw her, his whole face changed. Imani would remember that look for years, like she was the one thing in the world he had been searching for. After the wedding, everybody ate barbecue and macaroni and cheese in the church fellowship hall. Frankie Beverly played from somebody's speaker. Her cousins danced. Nathaniel's mother cried quietly in the corner. Around 9 that night, after everybody left, Nathaniel and Imani sat in the parking lot beside his old Honda with their shoes off, and leftover cake in styrofoam containers. "We're really married," Nathaniel said. Imani laughed. "You seem surprised. He looked at her. "I keep thinking I'm gonna wake up." "You better not," she said, "because we still owe your cousin $200 for those flowers." He laughed so hard he nearly dropped the cake. The first apartment they rented was in College Park, above a laundromat that always smelled like bleach and wet concrete. The walls were so thin they could hear their neighbor arguing with her boyfriend every Thursday night. The dishwasher never worked. The kitchen sink leaked. For the first 6 months, they ate dinner sitting on the floor because they couldn't afford a table. Still, those were some of the happiest years of Imani's life. Because every night, no matter how tired they were, they still felt like they were building something together. Nathaniel had an idea for a logistics company. Nothing big at first, just local shipping contracts, small businesses, warehouses. He spent nights at the kitchen counter with legal pads and spreadsheets, talking too fast whenever he got excited. Imani worked mornings at a bank and came home exhausted. Then she sat down beside him anyway. When he couldn't afford somebody to build a website, she stayed up until 2 in the morning watching YouTube tutorials and taught herself how to do it. When his invoices got confusing, she made spreadsheets. When he forgot to answer emails, she answered them. When he got his first tiny warehouse contract and panicked because he didn't know how to handle payroll, she sat cross-legged on the floor in old sweatpants eating vending machine chips while they figured it out together. "I'm serious," Nathaniel said one night around 2:30 in the morning, staring at her across the kitchen table. "I couldn't do this without you." Imani looked up from the laptop. "You better remember that when you're rich." He smiled. "I'll never forget." The next year was harder. Nathaniel lost money on a contract that fell apart. The transmission in his car died. One month, they were so behind on bills that Imani sat at the counter crying quietly while trying to decide which one they could afford to pay first. Nathaniel came into the kitchen and saw the stack of envelopes. Electric, rent, phone. He sat down beside her. "I'm sorry," he said. Imani wiped at her eyes quickly. "You don't have to apologize." "Yes, I do." "No." She looked at him. "We're in this together." That night, they ordered the cheapest Chinese takeout they could find and ate it on the floor out of white cartons. Nathaniel reached over and tucked a fortune cookie into her hand. She opened it. "A great future is waiting for you." Imani laughed. "See?" Nathaniel said. "The cookie knows." Years later, when his company finally started making real money, Nathaniel loved telling that story. At parties, at company dinners, during interviews. He always smiled and pointed at Imani. "She built this with me," he would say, and in those days he meant it. The first time the company landed a major contract, Nathaniel drove home so fast he nearly got a speeding ticket. Imani was in the kitchen making spaghetti. He burst through the front door, holding a folder. "We got it." She looked up. "What?" "We got it." He picked her up, right there in the kitchen, while she was still holding the wooden spoon. The sauce splattered all over the stove. They didn't care. A year later, they moved into a house in Winter Garden. Not huge, but bigger than anything they ever imagined when they were broke and eating Chinese food on the floor. Nathaniel bought Imani a necklace. Imani bought him a framed picture of the two of them standing in front of their first warehouse. Things changed slowly after that. So slowly that at first she almost didn't notice. Nathaniel started staying later at work, then later than that. He started talking differently too. Investors, expansion, brand image, board members. He bought suits that cost more than their first month's rent. He started taking calls during dinner. One night, she made his favorite meal and it sat cold on the table for an hour while he stood on the back patio arguing into his phone. When he finally came inside, she looked up from the untouched plates. "You could have at least texted." "I was busy." "So was I." Nathaniel sighed like she was being difficult. "Imani, not tonight." That was new. The first company dinner downtown happened a few months later. The restaurant overlooked the Orlando skyline. Everything was glass and dim lighting, and people speaking just a little too loudly. Nathaniel stood with a group of investors near the bar. He looked good, confident, sharp, comfortable. Imani watched him from across the room for a second before walking over. One of the men smiled politely. "Nathaniel," he said, "aren't you going to introduce us?" Nathaniel slipped an arm around her waist. "This is Imani," he said with a grin. She keeps me grounded." The men laughed. Then one of them looked at her. "So what do you do?" Before she could answer, Nathaniel smiled into his drink. "She doesn't have to work anymore." The group laughed again. Imani smiled, because that was what people do when they are embarrassed in public. But something inside her went quiet. On the drive home, Orlando blurred past the window in streaks of light. Nathaniel kept one hand on the steering wheel. "You've been quiet." Imani stared out at the dark road. "You embarrass me tonight." "What?" "You heard me." Nathaniel let out a short laugh. "Oh, come on. I'm serious. It was a joke." "No," she said softly. "It wasn't." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "You take everything so personal." The silence after that felt different from any silence they had ever shared before. Imani turned toward the window again. Outside, the city lights disappeared behind them. Inside the car, for the first time in years, she felt lonely sitting beside her husband. The silence in the car followed them all the way home. Nathaniel pulled into the driveway of their house in Winter Garden and turned off the engine, but neither of them moved. The garage light flickered overhead. Imani stared straight ahead. Nathaniel loosened his tie. "You're still upset?" Imani looked at him, slowly. "Still?" He sighed and leaned back against the seat. "I said I was joking." "No," she said quietly. "You said you were joking." Nathaniel rubbed his forehead like she was exhausting him. "You know what I meant." That was the problem. She did know what he meant. He meant she didn't matter in that room. He meant she was part of his life the way the house was part of his life. Useful, familiar, always there. She got out of the car without another word. After that, something between them shifted. Not all at once. Slowly, like a crack spreading through glass. Nathaniel started coming home later. At first it was small things. A dinner that ran long. A client who wanted to talk after a meeting. Traffic on I-4. Then it became whole nights. Miami, Atlanta, Tampa. Every explanation sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. One Tuesday night, Imani was sitting at the kitchen counter folding laundry, while a pot of gumbo cooled on the stove. Nathaniel had texted at 6, "Running late. Don't wait up." It was nearly 10. The television in the living room played quietly to an empty room. His bowl sat untouched on the counter. Imani folded the same towel 3 times, without realizing it. At 10:17, she heard his car pull into the driveway. Nathaniel walked in carrying his phone and the smell of expensive cologne she didn't recognize. "Sorry," he said, not looking at her. "Meeting ran over." Imani looked at him. "You ate?" "Yeah, you could have called." "I texted." "That's not the same thing." Nathaniel dropped his keys onto the counter harder than necessary. "Imani, I'm tired." "So am I." He looked at her then. Really looked. For a second, she thought maybe he was going to apologize. Instead, he said, "You knew what this would be like." She stared at him. "No," she said softly. "I knew what we would be like." Nathaniel looked away first. He picked up his phone and walked out onto the back patio. Through the kitchen window, she watched him pacing near the pool with his hand in his pocket, talking quietly, then smiling. That smile bothered her more than anything, because he didn't smile like that with her anymore. A few weeks later, Rochelle showed up on a Friday night with a bottle of wine and 2 Publix cupcakes in a plastic container. "Open the door before I start yelling and embarrass you in front of your rich neighbors," Rochelle called through the screen. Imani managed a small smile and let her in. Rochelle took one look at her and stopped. Imani was sitting at the kitchen counter in one of Nathaniel's old t-shirts, staring at a mug of coffee she had reheated twice and never finished. "Lord," Rochelle said quietly, "you look like somebody stole your spirit and forgot to put it back." "I'm fine." "You have said that every week for 3 months." Rochelle sat down across from her and pushed one of the cupcakes toward her. Red velvet. Imani's favorite. "You gonna tell me what's going on?" Imani looked down at her hands. The skin around her wedding ring had started to ache lately, like even her body knew something was wrong. "Nothing." "Imani." The way Rochelle said her name made something crack. Imani swallowed hard. "He's different." Rochelle was quiet. "Different? How?" Imani looked toward the dark window over the sink. Nathaniel still wasn't home. It was almost 11. Like, she stopped and tried again. Like he's here, but he's not. Rochelle didn't interrupt. Like every time he looks at me, he's already halfway somewhere else. Her voice dropped lower. It feels like he already left me and forgot to tell me. The room went still. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Rochelle reached across the counter and took her hand. Then stop waiting for him to come back while you disappear. Imani looked at her. What am I supposed to do? Rochelle held her gaze. Remember who you were before you spent your whole life making him feel important. Imani looked away because she didn't know anymore. Later that night, after Rochelle left, Imani sat alone in the living room with the lamp beside the couch turned on low. Nathaniel came home after midnight. He smelled like whiskey. You're still up? Imani looked at him. You said dinner. Nathaniel frowned. What? You texted me at 6 and said dinner. You came home 6 hours later. I told you. It ran long. She nodded slowly. Okay. Nathaniel stood there for a second, like he was waiting for a fight. When it didn't come, he looked almost relieved. He went upstairs. Imani stayed on the couch. A few minutes later, she heard the shower running. Then she heard Nathaniel's phone vibrate where he had left it on the kitchen counter. Once, then again. She didn't move at first. The screen lit up in the dark kitchen. No name, just a number she didn't recognize. And beneath it, 3 words. I already miss you. Imani stared at the screen until it went dark again. Then she heard the water shut off upstairs. Her hands were shaking. Not because she was surprised, because deep down, she wasn't. She stood in the kitchen holding onto the edge of the counter so tightly her fingers hurt. Upstairs, the man she had loved since she was 12 was toweling off after a shower. And downstairs, for the first time in 20 years, Imani realized she no longer recognized him. The next morning, Nathaniel kissed her forehead before he left. Breakfast meeting, he said, buttoning his shirt in the hallway mirror. Downtown. Probably won't be home till late. Imani stood in the kitchen holding her coffee mug with both hands. Okay. Nathaniel grabbed his keys from the bowl by the door. For a second, he looked at her like he was about to say something else. Then he didn't. The front door closed behind him. Imani waited exactly 10 minutes. Then she set her coffee in the sink, picked up her purse, and followed him. Her hands were shaking so badly, she almost missed the turn onto Colonial Drive. She hated herself for doing this. Hated that she was now the kind of woman who followed her husband in her car and parked across the street watching him through a windshield. 20 years. 20 years. And this was where they had ended up. Nathaniel didn't drive downtown. He turned toward Lake Eola. Imani stayed 2 cars behind him. Finally, he pulled into a parking space outside a small cafe with outdoor tables and potted plants near the front windows. Imani parked across the street beside a dry cleaner. Nathaniel got out. He checked his phone. Then he smiled. A minute later, a woman walked up to him. She was younger than Imani expected. 28, maybe. Long dark hair, white blouse, gold bracelet. The kind of effortless pretty that made it look like she had never had to wonder if she was enough. Nathaniel leaned down and kissed her before either of them even said hello. Imani stopped breathing. The morning traffic kept moving around her. A bus rolled past. A man walked a dog across the street. Inside the cafe, Nathaniel pulled out the woman's chair. Then he smiled at her. Not the polite smile he used at work. Not the distracted smile he gave Imani lately when he barely looked up from his phone. This was different. It was the smile he used to give Imani in diner parking lots and tiny apartments and church fellowship halls. The smile that said, I see you. Imani stared through the windshield until the coffee in the cup holder beside her went cold. She didn't cry. Not there. She just sat in the car and watched the man she had loved since she was 12 laugh with another woman like his whole life had not been built beside hers. By the time she got home, her chest hurt. The house was too quiet. She walked into the kitchen, set her purse down on the counter, and stood there. The sunlight through the window made everything look normal. The fruit bowl, the mail, Nathaniel's coffee cup still sitting beside the sink. Imani picked it up and threw it into the trash. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor. When Rochelle let herself in 40 minutes later, she found Imani still there. One look at her face, and Rochelle dropped her purse. Oh, baby. Imani tried to speak. Nothing came out. Then suddenly she was crying so hard she couldn't breathe. I saw him, she whispered. Rochelle sat down beside her on the floor, immediately. With who? A woman. The words tasted ugly. Outside some cafe near Lake Eola, Rochelle wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Imani folded into her. He smiled at her, she said, her voice breaking. Do you know what's crazy? That's the part I can't stop thinking about. Rochelle was quiet. Because he doesn't smile at me like that anymore. The kitchen clock ticked softly above the stove. Outside, somebody in the neighborhood started mowing their lawn. The whole world kept moving. Imani cried until her face hurt. I made him, she said finally. Every late night, every stupid dream, every time he wanted to quit. I was there. I know. I gave him everything. Rochelle pulled back just enough to look at her. And that is exactly why this is not your fault. For the next few weeks, Imani stopped asking questions. She didn't ask why Nathaniel came home late. She didn't ask who he was texting. She didn't ask why he smiled at his phone and turned the screen over when she walked into the room. Instead, she watched the new watch on his dresser, the expensive cologne, the extra care he suddenly took getting dressed for meetings. One night, Nathaniel stood in front of the bathroom mirror adjusting his tie. How do I look? He asked. Imani looked up from the bed, like somebody else's husband, but she didn't say that. You look fine. Nathaniel nodded once and walked out. An hour later, Imani found the receipt from a jewelry store in his jacket pocket while she was hanging it up. Nothing huge. A bracelet, $870. Not for her. Her birthday had been 2 months ago. He forgot until Rochelle reminded him. The next morning, she found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. There were dark circles under her eyes. She looked tired. Older, somehow. Like grief had moved into her body and unpacked its bags. That afternoon, Nathaniel came home early. He stood in the kitchen, loosening his tie. I'm heading to Tampa next weekend, he said casually. Client thing. I'll probably stay overnight. Imani kept slicing tomatoes on the cutting board. Okay. Nathaniel looked at her strangely. You're not going to ask anything? She set the knife down carefully. No. He stared at her for a second. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. Nathaniel glanced down at the screen and smiled before he could stop himself. It only lasted a second, but Imani saw it. Nathaniel looked up and realized she had seen it too. The smile disappeared. For one long moment, they just stood there in the kitchen. Two people in the same house. Two strangers. Then Nathaniel slid his phone back into his pocket. What? He said sharply. Imani looked at him. Nothing in his face looked familiar anymore. Nothing, she said quietly. But that wasn't true. Because standing there in her own kitchen, looking at the man she had spent half her life loving, Imani finally understood something that scared her more than the affair. She was starting to disappear. And if she stayed, one day there might be nothing left of her at all. 3 nights later, Nathaniel fell asleep in the study. His laptop was still open on the desk. The blue light from the screen spilled across the room. Imani stood in the doorway for a second, listening to the low sound of the television from downstairs and the steady hum of the air conditioner. Nathaniel had one arm thrown across his face. His reading glasses sat crooked on the edge of the desk. For a moment, he looked like the man she used to know. Tired, human, familiar. Then she looked at the laptop. She wasn't even trying to snoop anymore. At least, that was what she told herself. She walked over to close it. And there it was. An email confirmation. 2 first-class tickets from Orlando to New York. Leaving Friday morning. Returning Sunday night. Passenger 1, Nathaniel Bishop. Passenger 2, Vanessa Carter. Imani stared at the screen. Her chest went cold. Then she saw the date. April 18th. Their anniversary weekend. 21 years since the night she kissed him in the diner parking lot. She looked at Nathaniel asleep in the chair. The man who once cried when she walked down the aisle. The man who used to hold her hand in grocery stores and call her from work just to ask what she wanted for dinner. Now he was taking another woman to New York on their anniversary. Imani closed the laptop carefully. The next morning, Nathaniel was shaving when she stepped into the bathroom. Steam filled the room. He looked at her in the mirror. What? Are you going to New York next Friday? Nathaniel didn't even pause. Chicago, he said. Investor conference. Imani stared at him. You're sure? He rinsed the razor under the sink. Yeah. For a second, she almost said her name. Vanessa. Almost asked him if he was tired of lying. Instead, she nodded once. Right, she said quietly. That night, she slept in the guest room. Nathaniel never came to find her. A week later, Imani drove to her parents' house. The closer she got to Paramore, the more the city started to look like itself again. Small houses, corner stores, kids riding bikes in the street. Her father's old truck parked crooked in the driveway. The second she stepped inside, she smelled onions and garlic and baked macaroni. Her mother stood in the kitchen in an apron, pulling a pan out of the oven. She looked up and immediately knew. "Mama," Imani said. That was all. Her mother crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and wrapped her arms around her. Imani held on so tightly it hurt. Later, after dinner, after her cousins left and the dishes were stacked in the sink, she sat on the back porch with her father. The night air was warm. A porch light buzzed overhead. Her father handed her a glass of sweet tea and sat down beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You remember when you were little and you wanted to be a flight attendant?" Imani looked down. "You remember that? You used to walk around this house with one of your mama's scarves around your neck talking about peanuts and emergency exits." She smiled in spite of herself. "I forgot about that." "No," her father said gently. "You buried it." The words sat between them. Imani looked out at the dark yard. "I don't know who I am anymore." Her father was quiet for a second. "You know what the hardest thing is?" "What?" "When you spend so much time building somebody else's life, you forget you got one of your own." Imani looked down at the glass in her hands. The ice had started to melt. "I don't even know where to start." "Yes, you do." She looked at him. "You always knew." The next morning, she went into the garage and pulled down an old storage box from a shelf. Dust covered the lid. Inside were old notebooks, college papers, a faded acceptance letter. Then she found the folder, Travel and Hospitality Management. Inside was an old photo of her standing in front of Orlando International Airport at 23, wearing a navy blazer and smiling so hard her whole face looked different. She sat on the garage floor and stared at it. Back then, she had been halfway through an airline hospitality program. Then Nathaniel's company started struggling. "We need to focus on the business," he had told her. "Later, when things settle down, you can do whatever you want." Things never settled down. Her dreams just got smaller and smaller until eventually they disappeared. Or maybe they had just been waiting. 3 days later, Imani walked into a flight attendant training center near Orlando International Airport. The woman at the front desk smiled. "Can I help you?" Imani took a breath. "I'd like an application." The woman handed her a clipboard. "You have any experience?" "A long time ago." The woman smiled. "Think you still remember how?" Imani looked through the glass doors toward the runway outside. A plane lifted slowly into the sky. For the first time in months, something inside her moved. Not happiness. Something smaller, stronger. Hope. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think I do." Nathaniel barely noticed anything had changed. He noticed she was quieter. He noticed she stopped asking where he was going. He noticed she no longer waited up for him. But he didn't notice why. Because Nathaniel had made the same mistake a lot of people make when they think somebody will love them forever. He thought she would always be there. The acceptance email came on a Thursday night. Imani was alone in the kitchen when her phone buzzed. "Congratulations. We are pleased to offer you a position." Her hands shook as she read it. Then she opened the attached training schedule. Her eyes moved down the page. Training route assignment, Orlando to New York. Friday, April 18th. Imani stared at the screen for a long time. Then she looked toward the stairs, where Nathaniel was upstairs packing for a trip he still thought she knew nothing about. Slowly, she set the phone down, and for the first time in months, she stopped crying. Because now, she knew exactly what she was going to do. The morning of the flight, Imani left before sunrise. The house was still dark. Nathaniel was asleep upstairs, one arm hanging over the side of the bed, his phone charging on the nightstand beside him. For a second, Imani stood in the doorway and looked at him. There had been a time when she knew every part of this man, the crease between his eyebrows when he was worried, the way he mumbled in his sleep when he was exhausted, the way he always forgot his charger when he traveled. Her chest tightened. Then she walked downstairs. The kitchen was spotless. She rinsed out her coffee cup, straightened the stack of mail on the counter, and tore a piece of paper from the small notepad beside the refrigerator. "Don't forget your charger." You always forget your charger. She stared at the note for a second. Then she set it beside the toaster and picked up her suitcase. By the time Nathaniel came downstairs an hour later, the house was empty. He stood in the kitchen in his socks, loosening the collar of his button-down shirt. The note caught his eye. He picked it up and smiled, without meaning to. Don't forget your charger. You always forget your charger. For a moment, something uncomfortable moved in his chest. Then his phone buzzed. Vanessa, can't wait to get away with you. Nathaniel slipped the note into his jacket pocket. By the time he picked Vanessa up, the feeling was gone. Vanessa was waiting outside her apartment building in a cream-colored coat and heels, dragging a small designer suitcase behind her. You're late, she said, climbing into the passenger seat. By 3 minutes. Still late. She smiled when she said it. Nathaniel smiled back automatically. As they pulled onto the highway toward Orlando International Airport, Vanessa tucked one leg underneath her and held up her phone. Okay, she said. We are absolutely going to that rooftop place in Manhattan. Nathaniel glanced at the screen. I'm sure. And I made us a reservation at that little Italian place in Soho for Saturday. Sounds good. Vanessa looked over at him. You don't sound excited. I am. You've said maybe 6 words since you picked me up. Nathaniel looked back at the road. The sky was pale gray. Traffic moved slowly near the airport exit. I'm just tired, he said. Vanessa reached over and touched his hand. You work too much. Nathaniel almost laughed. If she knew how much of his life had been built by somebody else, she would never say that. But Vanessa didn't know that version of him. She only knew the finished version. The man in expensive suits. The man who stayed in nice hotels and never worried about paying bills. She had never seen him at 25, sitting on the floor of a tiny apartment while Imani built spreadsheets beside him because they couldn't afford an accountant. She had never seen Imani asleep at the kitchen table with her head next to a laptop after helping him fix his website at 2 a.m. Vanessa knew the polished version. Lately, Nathaniel had started believing that version too. The first-class lounge at Orlando International Airport was crowded and too cold. Vanessa disappeared to get coffee. Nathaniel sat by the window with his phone in his hand. Outside, planes rolled slowly across the runway. For no reason he could explain, he suddenly thought about Imani standing in their kitchen the night before. She had been quiet again. Not angry, not asking questions, just quiet. He used to know what her silence meant. Now he didn't. Vanessa came back and handed him a coffee, earth to Nathaniel. He looked up. What? You are somewhere else today. No, I'm not. She sat beside him. You sure? Nathaniel forced a smile. I'm fine. But he wasn't. Something felt off, like he had forgotten something important. 20 minutes later, they boarded. Vanessa walked ahead of him down the jet bridge, talking about whether they should see a show while they were in New York. Nathaniel barely heard her. The closer they got to the plane, the worse the feeling got. Then they stepped into first class. Welcome aboard, a flight attendant said from somewhere near the front. Nathaniel looked up and stopped breathing. Imani stood in the aisle beside the drink cart. Her navy blue uniform fit perfectly. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She looked calm, too calm. For one terrible second, Nathaniel honestly thought he was imagining her. Vanessa smiled politely and slipped into the window seat in 2A. Nathaniel stayed frozen in the aisle. Imani looked at him. Nothing in her face moved. No shock, no anger, no tears. Just a kind of quiet that scared him more than anything else. Good morning, she said. Nathaniel stared at her. Imani. Vanessa looked up. You know her? Imani picked up a small tray of glasses. Can I get either of you something before takeoff? She asked. Nathaniel still couldn't speak. Vanessa laughed, awkwardly. Champagne? Of course. Imani wrote something on her notepad. Then she looked at Nathaniel. And for you? He stared at her face, the pale place on her finger where her wedding ring used to be, the tiny line between her eyebrows that only appeared when she was trying not to cry. He had put that look there. Imani, what are you doing here? Vanessa looked between them. Nathaniel? Imani didn't answer him. She waited. The whole cabin suddenly felt too quiet. A man in the seat across the aisle glanced up from his newspaper. Someone farther back was struggling with a suitcase. The door to the plane was still open. Nathaniel swallowed. That's my wife, he said. The words landed between them like something breaking. Vanessa went completely still. What? Nathaniel looked down. Vanessa laughed once, not because anything was funny, because she honestly could not believe what she had just heard. You said you were separated. We basically are. Imani finally looked at Vanessa. There was no anger in her face. That somehow made it worse. You should ask him what basically means, she said quietly. Then she set the champagne glass down in front of Vanessa. Vanessa looked from the glass to Nathaniel, then back to Imani. The color slowly drained from her face, and for the first time since she met him, Vanessa realized she had no idea who Nathaniel really was. Vanessa stared at Nathaniel like she had never seen him before. The champagne glass sat untouched on the tray table between them. You lied to me. Her voice wasn't loud. That made it worse. People in first class had stopped pretending not to notice. The man across the aisle lowered his newspaper completely. A woman 2 rows back took off her headphones. Nathaniel leaned closer. Vanessa, please. Not here. Oh, now you care where this happens? She looked toward Imani, who was standing in the aisle with the drink tray in her hands. You told me you were living separate lives, Vanessa said. You told me she knew. Nathaniel rubbed a hand over his face. She does know things haven't been good. That is not the same thing. Vanessa's voice cracked. You said your marriage was over. Nathaniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because what could he say? That he had spent months telling 2 women 2 different versions of the same story, that he had wanted the comfort of his wife and the attention of his mistress, and somehow convinced himself he deserved both. Nathaniel, Vanessa said quietly, what is wrong with you? The question hung there. Imani looked down at the notepad in her hand. For a second, Nathaniel thought she might walk away. Instead, she stood there, still, composed, the same way she had stood beside him through every terrible year when the company almost failed and he was too proud to admit he was scared. Vanessa pushed back from her seat. I'm not doing this. Vanessa, wait. No. She grabbed her purse from the floor and stood so fast her bag knocked against the armrest. A flight attendant near the front looked over. Ma'am? We'll be closing the cabin door in a moment. Good, Vanessa said. Then maybe I should leave before I end up trapped in New York with somebody I don't know. Nathaniel stood up. Vanessa, please. She looked at him for one long second. You didn't just lie to your wife, she said. You lied to me too. Then she turned and walked off the plane. Nathaniel stood in the aisle watching her go. The cabin door closed behind her a minute later. He sat back down in seat 2A, alone. The empty seat beside him looked wrong. The champagne glass was still there. So was the silence. A few seconds later, Imani came back. She held out a cup of sparkling water. Nathaniel looked up at her. I don't want it. You do, she said quietly. You always get headaches when you drink before a flight. The words hit him hard, because she still knew him. After everything, she still knew him. He took the cup. Their fingers almost touched. Imani pulled her hand back immediately. Nathaniel, I can explain. She looked at him for a moment. Then she gave a small, tired smile. Not because anything was funny, because she had heard those words too many times. Can you? The plane started moving away from the gate. Nathaniel looked down at the water in his hand. I never meant for this to happen. Imani folded her arms. That sentence only works if something happened to you, she said quietly. You made choices. Nathaniel looked up. People around them had gone back to pretending they weren't listening. The hum of the plane filled the cabin. I know I messed up. You didn't mess up. Her voice never rose. That somehow made every word worse. You forgot your phone charger. You mess up a dinner reservation. You accidentally back into somebody's mailbox. Nathaniel stared at her. You don't spend months lying to your wife and then call it a mistake. He looked away. Out the window, the runway blurred past. I was going to tell you. Imani almost laughed again. When? He had no answer. The plane lifted into the air. For a few seconds, everything shook. Then Orlando disappeared beneath the clouds. Imani steadied herself against the seat. Nathaniel looked up at her. I know you hate me. Her face changed, just for a second. Not softer, sadder. I don't hate you, she said quietly. That would have been easier. Nathaniel looked down at his hands. I don't know when everything changed. I do. He looked up. Imani glanced down the aisle to make sure nobody needed her. then looked back at him. It changed when you stopped seeing me. Nathaniel opened his mouth. She kept going. I spent years helping you build your company. I stayed up with you when you were broke and scared, and convinced nobody would ever take you seriously. He looked down. I know. No, you don't. The words came out sharper than anything else she had said. You know the version that sounds nice when you tell the story. Nathaniel stared at her. You think I was just helping you. You were. I was building it too. The silence between them felt huge. Imani looked at him, and suddenly he saw it, not just the hurt, the exhaustion, the weight of years. I stopped being your wife a long time ago, she said quietly. I became your assistant, your excuse, your safety net. That's not true. It is. No, it isn't. Imani looked at him. Then tell me the last time you asked me what I wanted. Nathaniel froze. She waited. He couldn't answer, because he didn't know. He knew what kind of wine she liked. He knew she hated driving in the rain. He knew she still cried during old movies. But he didn't know what she wanted anymore, because somewhere along the way, he had stopped asking. Imani looked down at the empty seat beside him, then back at him. You know the saddest part? She asked softly. What? I kept thinking if I loved you hard enough, the man I knew when we were young would come back. Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. Imani. But he didn't. She stepped back then. The conversation was over, at least for now. Nathaniel sat there alone while she moved through the cabin, helping passengers, answering questions, smiling politely. And every time she passed his seat, she looked more like herself than she had in years. Not the tired woman sitting alone in a big house waiting for him to come home. This version, calm, certain, gone. Halfway through the flight, Nathaniel reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed the folded note. Don't forget your charger. You always forget your charger. He stared at the words until they blurred. Because even that morning, even after everything, she had still been thinking about him. And he had spent their anniversary trying to leave her behind. Nathaniel spent the rest of the flight pretending to look out the window. Below him, clouds stretched across the sky like nothing had happened. The man across the aisle eventually went back to his newspaper. The woman 2 rows back fell asleep with her head against the window. Everything inside the cabin settled. Everything inside Nathaniel didn't. Every few minutes, Imani walked past his seat. She smiled at passengers, asked if anyone wanted coffee, helped an older woman lift her bag down from the overhead compartment. She looked calm, like she had been carrying something heavy for so long that finally putting it down had made her lighter. Nathaniel remembered another flight years ago. They were both 27, flying to Atlanta because they couldn't afford a real honeymoon after the wedding. Imani had fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder before the plane even took off. Halfway through the flight, the woman across the aisle smiled at them and said, "You two look newly married." Nathaniel had looked down at Imani and grinned. "We are." Back then, he couldn't imagine wanting anyone else. Back then, he couldn't imagine hurting her. Now she walked past him without touching him, without even looking at him. The captain's voice came over the speaker. "We'll begin our descent into New York shortly." Passengers started putting away laptops and folding tray tables. Nathaniel looked down at the note in his hand again. The edges were wrinkled from where he had folded and unfolded it all flight. "Don't forget your charger. You always forget your charger." He closed his eyes. There had been 100 chances to stop this. The first time Vanessa texted him late at night, the first lie, the first hotel room, the first time he looked at his wife and knew he was keeping something from her. But he kept choosing himself. Now he was finally sitting with what that choice had cost him. When the plane landed, the wheels hit the runway hard enough to jolt everyone in their seats. A few people clapped softly. Nathaniel almost laughed at that. The plane rolled toward the gate. Then everybody stood up at once, impatient and tired, and reaching for their bags. Nathaniel stayed where he was. He watched people file out row by row. He watched Imani stand near the front of the cabin beside the exit door. By the time the last passenger walked off, they were alone. For a second, neither of them moved. The cabin looked different, empty, smaller. The half-finished glass of sparkling water still sat on Nathaniel's tray table. He stood slowly and picked up his bag. Then he walked toward her. Imani kept one hand on the handle beside the door. Outside, through the open doorway, he could see the jet bridge waiting. A man in a reflective vest stood outside talking to another flight attendant. Everything normal, everything ruined. Nathaniel stopped in front of her. Up close, she looked tired, not weak, just tired. Like she had been carrying the same pain for so long, she no longer had the strength to hide it. "I'm sorry," he said. The words sounded small. Imani looked at him. "You should be." Nathaniel swallowed hard. "I know." She looked down for a second, then back at him. "You know what's crazy?" "What?" "I really believed you would never do this to me." Nathaniel felt something twist inside his chest. "I know." "No, you don't." Her voice stayed soft. That somehow hurt more than if she had screamed. "You know what it feels like to get caught," she said. "You don't know what it feels like to spend months sitting across from somebody you love while they slowly turn into a stranger." Nathaniel looked away, because she was right. He had spent months protecting himself from guilt. She had spent months living inside it. "I love you," he said suddenly. The words came out before he could stop them. Imani stared at him. There were tears in her eyes now. That made it worse, because part of her still loved him too. Nathaniel could see it, and somehow that hurt more than if she hated him. "I love you," he said again, his voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I love you." Imani looked down at the floor for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "I know." Nathaniel closed his eyes. "Then please." "Please what?" "I don't know." He looked at her helplessly. "Don't give up on me." Imani let out a shaky breath. For a second, he thought she might cry. Instead, she straightened her shoulders. "You loved me the way people love a house," she said quietly. Nathaniel frowned. What? A house, they forgot, helped keep them warm. The words hit him so hard he could not move. Imani looked at him with tears shining in her eyes. "You only notice what it gave you after it's gone." Nathaniel stared at her. Every memory came at him all at once. Imani asleep at the kitchen table beside his laptop. Imani laughing in their first apartment. Imani bringing him food when he forgot to eat. Imani standing beside him at every stage of his life while he acted like she would always be there no matter what he did. "Imani," she shook her head. "I spent years loving you," she said. "I kept thinking if I gave enough and waited enough and forgave enough, eventually you would come back to me." Nathaniel felt tears burning in his eyes. "But you didn't." He looked down, because there was nothing to say. She was right. The boy from Paramore, the man who sat on the hood of his Honda and told her there was nothing wrong with her, the husband who cried when she walked down the aisle. Somewhere along the way, he had become someone else, and maybe the worst part was that he hadn't even noticed when it happened. Imani stepped aside from the door. "You should go." Nathaniel looked at her. He wanted to say one more thing, to promise he would change, to tell her he would fix it. But for the first time in his life, he understood that promises meant nothing if the person listening had already run out of reasons to believe them. So he nodded. Then he picked up his bag and walked off the plane alone. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he turned back once. Imani was still standing in the doorway. She looked smaller from far away, but somehow stronger. Then the cabin door closed between them, and Nathaniel understood, with a kind of sick certainty, that he might have just destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to him. Nathaniel got home just after midnight. The house was dark. No television in the living room, no lamp on in the kitchen, no soft music playing upstairs while Imani folded laundry or read in bed. Just silence. He stood in the doorway with his suitcase still in his hand. For years, he used to complain when the house felt too quiet. Now the silence had weight. He set his bag down and looked toward the kitchen. The note she had left him that morning was still folded in his pocket. "Don't forget your charger. You always forget your charger." Nathaniel closed his eyes. Then he walked upstairs. The bedroom door was open. The first thing he noticed was the closet. Half of it was empty. The dresses she wore to church, gone. The bright yellow sweater she always put on when she was cold, gone. The shoebox on the top shelf where she kept old birthday cards and movie ticket stubs, gone. Nathaniel stood there, staring. Then he looked toward the nightstand. The framed wedding picture was missing. Only the pale square on the wood remained where it had been sitting for years. Something in his chest cracked. He walked farther into the room. There was an envelope on the dresser, his name written across the front in Imani's handwriting. Nathaniel sat on the edge of the bed before he opened it. Inside was her wedding ring and a folded piece of paper. I spent years believing loving you meant disappearing for you. I know now that real love should never cost someone themselves. I hope one day you become the man we both believed you were. Imani. Nathaniel read it once, then again, then a third time. The room blurred. He bent forward with the letter still in his hands and cried. Not the quiet kind. Not the kind where you wipe your face and pretend you're fine. He cried with his head in his hands and his shoulders shaking, because the one person who had loved him before he had money, before he had success, before he had anything, was gone, and it was his fault. The next few weeks passed in a fog. Nathaniel stopped sleeping. He would lie awake in the bed that suddenly felt too big and stare at the ceiling until sunrise. Sometimes he thought he heard Imani downstairs, the sound of a cabinet closing, the hum of her voice while she cooked. Once, he walked into the kitchen half asleep, because he could have sworn he smelled coffee and cinnamon. The room was empty. At work, things started slipping. Nathaniel forgot meetings, missed calls. One afternoon, he sat in the conference room while 3 men talked about expansion into Texas. He heard every word. None of it stayed in his head. When the meeting ended, he remained sitting there staring at the legal pad in front of him. Mr. Jenkins stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. Mr. Jenkins had worked for Nathaniel since the beginning, back when the office was one tiny room with a broken printer and a leaking ceiling. He sat down across from Nathaniel. "You look terrible," he said. Nathaniel let out a tired laugh. "Thanks." Mr. Jenkins folded his hands. "I heard what happened." Nathaniel looked away. People talk. They do. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Mr. Jenkins said, "I knew your wife when y'all were still broke." Nathaniel stared down at the table. "I know." "No," Mr. Jenkins said quietly. "You know now." Nathaniel looked up. Mr. Jenkins leaned back in the chair. "That woman held your whole life together." Nathaniel swallowed hard. He thought about Imani sitting beside him at 2 a.m. with a calculator and a bag of chips. Imani answering emails while working a full-time job. Imani reminding him to call his mother. Imani making sure his employees got flowers when somebody in their family died. All the invisible things. The things he stopped noticing because she did them so well. "She believed in you before anybody else did," Mr. Jenkins said. "Don't ever forget that." Nathaniel looked down at his hands. Too late. Across town, Imani was carrying boxes into a second-floor apartment near Baldwin Park. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, tiny kitchen, old countertops, nothing like the house she had left behind. Rochelle followed her up the stairs, carrying a lamp in one hand and 2 grocery bags in the other. "I just want you to know," Rochelle said, slightly out of breath, "if I throw my back out helping you move, you owe me at least 2 margaritas and a good obituary." Imani smiled weakly. "I'll make sure they mention your good hair." "Damn right." They carried the last box inside. The apartment smelled like fresh paint and cardboard. Most of the furniture still hadn't arrived. Imani sat down on the floor in the middle of the living room and looked around. There was nothing on the walls. No wedding photos. No expensive furniture Nathaniel picked out. No life. Not yet. Rochelle handed her a container of takeout and sat across from her on the floor. For a few minutes, they ate in silence. Then Rochelle looked around. "Well," she said, "your apartment is tiny." Imani laughed softly. "It is, but your piece?" Rochelle opened the bottle of wine she had brought and poured some into 2 paper cups. "Your piece looks expensive." Imani looked around the room again, at the half-open boxes, at the sunlight coming through the balcony door, at the quiet. For months, she had been afraid of being alone. Now, sitting on the floor in that empty apartment, she realized something. She was lonely in her marriage long before she was ever alone. Rochelle held up her cup. "To new beginnings." Imani touched her cup against Rochelle's. Then, for the first time in months, she laughed. A real laugh. And somewhere across town, sitting alone in the giant house he once thought proved he had made it, Nathaniel stared at the empty side of the bed and realized there was no amount of money in the world that could buy back the woman who used to sleep there. Imani's apartment started to feel like home in small ways. A plant on the balcony, her grandmother's old yellow mixing bowl on the kitchen counter, music playing while she cooked. On her days off, she opened the windows and let the Florida air move through the rooms. She bought bright blue curtains because Nathaniel always hated bright colors. Then she laughed at herself for thinking about what Nathaniel hated while standing in her own apartment. The job helped. The first few weeks at the airline were exhausting. Early mornings, delayed flights, smiling when she didn't feel like smiling. But it also felt good. Good to wear a uniform with her own name on it. Good to move through airports full of people coming and going and starting over. Some days she flew to Chicago. Some days, Phoenix. Once, Seattle. Every city felt like proof that the world was bigger than the life she had spent years trapped inside. On the day she wasn't working, she met Rochelle at Lake Eola before sunrise. They walked the path around the water with coffee in their hands, while joggers passed them and ducks drifted near the edge. One morning, Rochelle looked over at her. "You know you've started wearing color again, right?" Imani looked down at her sweatshirt. "Bright red." She smiled. "I guess I have. You used to wear gray all the time." Because Nathaniel said bright colors were too much. Rochelle stopped walking, and somehow that man convinced you that you were the one taking up too much space. Imani laughed softly. The old version of herself would have defended him, would have said he didn't mean it like that. Now she just kept walking. The hard days still came. A song in the grocery store, an old picture in her phone, the empty space beside her in bed. Sometimes she still missed him. Not Nathaniel as he had become, the boy from Paramore, the man who used to dance with her in the kitchen while dinner burned, the version of him that made her feel chosen. But every time she started missing him too much, she remembered the plane, the look on his face when he saw her, the way he only finally saw her when he was about to lose her. That helped. One Sunday, she drove to her parents' house for dinner. The same house, the same porch, the same smell of onions and garlic when she walked through the front door. Loretta was sitting in her chair by the window, shelling peas into a bowl. "You're late," Loretta said without looking up. "Hi to you too. Don't get smart with me. Sit down and help." Imani smiled and sat beside her. For a while, they shelled peas in silence. Her mother and aunt argued in the kitchen about whether the macaroni needed more cheese. Her cousins were in the backyard laughing too loud. For the first time in months, Imani felt something loosen inside her. Later that evening, after dinner, Loretta called her into the kitchen. "You still walking around here looking like somebody stole your purse?" Loretta asked. Imani smiled tiredly. A little. Loretta reached over and took her hand. "Baby, you keep acting like you lost everything." Imani looked down. "It feels like I did." "No." Loretta squeezed her fingers. "You are not the one who lost everything." The words stayed with her. 2 months later, Nathaniel heard Imani's name in a room full of strangers. He was at a charity luncheon downtown, one of those expensive events with tiny salads and people talking about community while checking their phones under the table. Nathaniel barely wanted to be there. He had lost weight. His suits hung differently now. He still worked too much, but nothing felt the same. Every success felt flat. Every room felt too quiet. Then the woman at the podium smiled. "And now, we'd like to introduce the newest board member of our scholarship initiative for young black women in Orlando." Nathaniel looked up. Imani walked onto the stage. He stopped breathing. She looked beautiful, not because of the navy dress, because of the way she carried herself. Confident, steady, whole. The room applauded. Nathaniel stared. The woman at the podium kept talking. Many people know Imani Bishop from her work with Horizon Air and her support of this community for years. Nathaniel swallowed hard. But what most people do not know is that she has quietly been a major force behind Bishop Logistics since the very beginning. He sat up straighter. The woman smiled toward Imani. As a majority owner and early investor, Imani helped build the company from the ground up. Her business strategies and employee retention ideas helped turn a small local operation into one of the most successful logistics companies in Florida. The room applauded again. Nathaniel felt like the floor had dropped beneath him. He stared at Imani. She looked uncomfortable with the attention, but she didn't deny it. She just smiled politely. Years ago, when Loretta died, she had left Imani money. Nathaniel remembered that. He remembered Imani saying she wanted to put it toward their future. He thought she meant bills, a house, something small. He never knew she had invested it in the company, never knew she had kept ownership papers, never knew she had protected herself, because he never asked. because somewhere along the way, he had stopped believing she had a life beyond him. Now she stood on a stage, while a room full of people applauded the woman he had spent years treating like she was only there to support him. Nathaniel sat frozen in his chair. For the first time in his life, he realized something that should have been obvious years ago. Imani had never been standing behind him. She had been standing beside him the whole time. The luncheon ended 20 minutes later. Nathaniel barely remembered standing up, barely remembered shaking anyone's hand or answering questions about the company. All he could think about was Imani. By the time he got outside, the Florida heat hit him like a wall. Cars moved slowly through the valet line. People stood in little groups near the entrance, talking and laughing. Then he saw her. Imani was standing near the curb with Rochelle. She was holding her purse in one hand and a folder from the luncheon in the other. Rochelle noticed him first. "Oh, absolutely not," Rochelle muttered. Imani turned. The second she saw Nathaniel, something in her face closed. Not anger, not sadness, distance. "Imani," Nathaniel said. Rochelle folded her arms. "No, Rochelle," Imani said quietly. "It's okay." "No, it's not." Rochelle looked at Nathaniel. "You do not get to show up now because somebody finally said out loud what she has always been to you." Nathaniel looked down, because she was right. Rochelle shook her head and stepped away toward the parking lot. "You have 5 minutes," she said to Imani. "Then I'm driving us to get tacos and emotionally recover." Imani almost smiled. Then Rochelle walked away. Nathaniel stood there for a second. The air between them felt awkward and fragile. "You own part of the company?" he asked finally. Imani looked at him. "I always did." "Why didn't you tell me?" The second the words came out, Nathaniel hated them, because even to him, they sounded ridiculous. Imani let out a short laugh, not because she thought anything was funny. "I did tell you." Nathaniel frowned. "When?" "Years ago." She looked away toward the street. "After my grandmother died." The memory hit him slowly. Imani sitting at their kitchen table with a folder in front of her, him half listening while answering emails, her saying something about the inheritance and an attorney and protecting the business. Nathaniel had nodded without really paying attention. At the time, all he could think about was making payroll. He looked back at her. "I don't remember." "I know." The words landed harder than he expected. Cars rolled past behind them. Somewhere across the street, somebody honked. Nathaniel looked at her. "You really built it with me." Imani stared at him for a second. Then she shook her head. "No." Nathaniel blinked. "What?" "I built it too." The truth of it settled over him. All those years. The website. The spreadsheets. The ideas he repeated in meetings like they were his. The way she remembered birthdays and sick kids and things that made people feel cared for. He had always called those things support, because support sounded smaller, safer. It let him keep pretending he had done it all himself. "You were never just helping me," he said quietly. Imani looked down. "No." Nathaniel stepped closer. "I made the biggest mistake of my life." "Yes," she said. The honesty in her voice nearly broke him. "I know I don't deserve anything from you." "No," she said softly. "You don't." Nathaniel looked at her. There were tears in her eyes, but she didn't look weak. She looked tired, like she had spent too many years carrying something heavy and had finally decided to put it down. "I miss you," he said. Imani closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them again, there were tears there. "I know." "Then please." "Please what?" "Let me fix this." Imani stared at him. "You think because you finally see my value, I'm supposed to come back?" "That's not what I mean." "Yes, it is." Nathaniel looked away. Because maybe it was. Maybe part of him had spent months believing Imani would always be there, no matter what he did. And now that she wasn't, he suddenly saw everything he had ignored. The problem was, she had been valuable all along. He just hadn't looked. "You only miss me now because you lost access to me," Imani said quietly. "That's not true, isn't it?" Nathaniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because he didn't know anymore. He loved her. He knew that. But love had not stopped him from lying. Love had not stopped him from making her feel small. "I loved you," he said. Imani's face changed. Not softer, sadder. "I know you did." "Then why does it feel like you're talking about me, like I'm already gone?" "Because the man I loved is gone." The words sat between them. Nathaniel looked like she had slapped him. Imani took a shaky breath. I spent years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. That's not fair. No? She asked. Tell me one thing you gave up for me. Nathaniel froze. She waited. He thought about the house, the company, the trips, the meetings. Everything in his life had always made room for him. Imani had been the one doing the moving, the adjusting, the sacrificing. I don't know, he said quietly. I know. The tears finally slipped down her face. She wiped them away quickly. You spent so many years making me believe I needed you, she said, but I never did. Nathaniel looked at her. The woman standing in front of him was not the woman who sat alone in the kitchen waiting for him to come home. This woman knew who she was, and somehow that scared him more than losing her. Rochelle honked from the car. Imani looked toward the parking lot, then back at Nathaniel. For a long time, she said quietly, I thought losing you would destroy me. Nathaniel's throat tightened, but it didn't. She stepped back, and that's how I finally knew I was going to be okay. Then she turned and walked toward Rochelle's car. Nathaniel stood there in the heat and watched her leave. This time, he didn't follow, because for the first time, he understood something that should have terrified him years ago. Imani had never been just his wife. She had been the strongest thing in his life, and now she was learning how to live without him. By December, the papers were ready. Nathaniel sat in the lawyer's office, staring at the stack in front of him. The room smelled like coffee and printer paper. Rain tapped softly against the window. Across the table, Imani sat with her hands folded in her lap. She wore a dark green sweater and small gold earrings. She looked calm, not cold, just calm. Nathaniel hated that, not because he wanted her to be angry, because he remembered when he used to know exactly what she was feeling. Now she looked at him the way people look at a city they used to live in. Familiar, far away. The lawyer slid the papers across the table. All right, he said gently. Once both of you sign, everything is final. Nathaniel stared down at the line with his name under it. He thought about the church, the little apartment, the note in his pocket. Don't forget your charger. You always forget your charger. He still carried it, folded soft at the edges now. His hand shook when he picked up the pen. Imani watched him, not with anger, with something worse, sadness. Nathaniel signed first, then he pushed the papers across the table. Imani looked down. For 1 second, he thought she might stop, might look at him and say something. Instead, she picked up the pen and signed her name, just like that. 20 years, gone in less than an hour. The lawyer said something about copies and next steps. Neither of them listened. When they walked out into the parking lot, it was still raining. Nathaniel stood beside his car. Imani stood a few feet away, holding her umbrella. For a second, it felt like maybe he should say something. I'm sorry. I still love you. Please. But all of it sounded too small. Imani looked at him. Take care of yourself, she said quietly. Then she got into her car and drove away. Nathaniel stood in the rain long after she was gone. The months after the divorce felt strange. Nathaniel kept going to work. He kept wearing the suits, kept sitting through meetings. But nothing fit anymore. Not the office, not the house, not even his own life. One night, he came home after work and found himself sitting in the driveway with the engine still running. The house looked exactly the same, but it didn't feel like his. He finally went inside. The kitchen was dark. The living room was silent. He opened the refrigerator and stared at leftovers he never ate. Then he noticed something in the back of a drawer. An old grocery list in Imani's handwriting. Orange juice, rice, laundry detergent. Nathaniel sat down at the kitchen table with the paper in his hand and cried so hard he had to put his head down. Meanwhile, Imani kept moving forward. Not perfectly. Some mornings, she still woke up, missing him. Some nights she still sat on the edge of her bed and wondered how two people could love each other for so long and still end up here. But she kept going. She worked. She traveled. She learned how to make her apartment feel like home. By spring, she had started volunteering with the Scholarship Foundation from the luncheon. Twice a month, she met with young women from around Orlando. Some wanted to start businesses. Some wanted to leave home. Some just wanted somebody to tell them they were allowed to want more. One Thursday evening, after a workshop, a college student stopped her in the parking lot. She looked nervous. You make it sound easy, the girl said. Imani smiled a little. It wasn't easy. The girl looked down. I've been with my boyfriend since high school, and sometimes I think I'm making my whole life smaller to make him comfortable. Imani stood quietly for a second. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead. She could hear traffic from the street. For a moment, she saw herself at 23, then 30, then 38, always waiting, always adjusting, always telling herself love meant holding on. What if he leaves? The girl asked, softly. Imani looked at her. There was so much fear in her face. The kind of fear that comes from believing your life only matters if somebody chooses you. Imani knew that fear. She had built a whole life around it. Then she said, very gently, the better question is what happens if you keep leaving yourself? The girl looked at her. Imani smiled sadly. I got tired of abandoning myself. The girl's eyes filled with tears. She nodded once. Then she whispered, I think I needed to hear that. Later that night, Imani drove home with the windows down. The Florida air moved through the car. At a stoplight, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. For a second, she barely recognized herself, not because she looked different, because she didn't look lost anymore. Across town, Nathaniel sat alone in the dark living room of the house they used to share. The note from the morning of the flight was in his hand again. He read it so often he knew every curve of every letter. Don't forget your charger. You always forget your charger. He closed his eyes. Then, for the first time since the divorce, he finally admitted something to himself. He had spent years believing Imani would always stay. Now she was gone. And he had no idea who he was without the woman who had spent 20 years helping him become somebody. Nearly a year after the flight, Nathaniel drove back to Paramore. He had not been there in years. The neighborhood looked smaller than he remembered. The sidewalks were cracked. The old basketball hoop at the end of the street leaned slightly to one side. Some of the houses had been painted, some had not. But Imani's grandmother's house was still there. The porch sagged a little more now. The white paint had faded. The folding chair Loretta used to sit in was gone. Nathaniel parked across the street and turned off the engine. For a long time, he just sat there. He looked at the house, then at the sidewalk where he used to ride his bike, then at the curb where he and Imani once sat eating popsicles after school because the power had gone out in both their houses. Everything was still here, except them. Nathaniel rested his hands against the steering wheel. He thought about the man he had become, the suits, the money, the attention. He had spent so many years trying to prove he was enough. And when people finally started treating him like he mattered, he held onto that feeling so tightly that he forgot the person who had always made him feel like he mattered in the first place. A car door slammed down the street. Nathaniel looked up. Imani was walking toward the house. She carried a foil pan in one hand and her purse in the other. Her hair was pulled back. She wore jeans and a soft blue sweater. She looked surprised when she saw him standing by his car. Nathaniel? He nodded once. Hi. For a second, neither of them moved. The evening air smelled like barbecue and fresh-cut grass. Somewhere nearby, music drifted from an open window. Imani looked toward the house. I was just going inside. I know. She waited. Nathaniel looked down at his hands, then back at her. I just wanted to see you. Imani didn't answer right away, because once upon a time, those words would have meant everything. Now they mostly made her tired. Nathaniel glanced around the neighborhood. Do you remember when your grandmother used to yell at me for riding my bike too fast? In spite of herself, Imani smiled a little. She said you were going to break your neck. I probably should have listened to her more. The smile faded. The silence came back. Nathaniel looked at her. You look good. Imani gave a small shrug. I'm okay. No, Nathaniel thought. You're more than okay. She looked like somebody who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. Nathaniel looked toward the old porch. I blamed money for a long time, he said quietly. Imani frowned slightly. What do you mean? I told myself success changed me. He looked down, but it wasn't the money. Imani stood still. The foil pan in her hand reflected the porch light. It was me, Nathaniel said. The words sounded raw, like he had never said them out loud before. I got so afraid of not being enough that when people finally started acting like I mattered, I started needing it. Imani watched him. Nathaniel laughed once, no humor in it. I liked being the important one. The truth sat between them. Ugly, honest. I liked walking into a room and having people look at me like I was somebody. Imani looked away, because she knew exactly what came next. And somewhere along the way, Nathaniel said quietly, I started treating you like you were just part of my life. He swallowed hard, like you would always be there no matter what I did. Imani looked back at him. The old version of herself would have rushed to comfort him, would have said he wasn't a bad person, would have tried to make this easier. Now she just listened. Nathaniel's eyes were red. I loved you. Imani closed her eyes briefly. I know. No, he said, his voice shaking. I loved you. He stopped. He looked down at the cracked sidewalk, then back at her. I loved my ego more. The words hit her harder than she expected, because she had known it for a long time. But hearing him say it out loud made something inside her finally settle. For years, she had wondered what she did wrong, why she wasn't enough, why loving him hadn't been enough to make him stay the man she married. Now she understood. It had never been about her. Nathaniel looked at her. I think I kept needing everybody to tell me I mattered, because deep down, I never believed it. The street was quiet. A few houses down, somebody laughed. For a second, Nathaniel looked like the boy she used to know, the one who sat on the hood of his Honda and admitted he felt invisible in his own house. Imani's chest ached, because she still loved that boy. But the man standing in front of her had hurt her too much to become him again. You should have told me, she said softly. Nathaniel looked at her. I know. We could have fought about it. We could have gone to counseling. We could have... Her voice caught. We could have at least been honest. Nathaniel looked away, because honesty would have meant admitting he was broken in a way money couldn't fix. Instead, he found Vanessa, found applause, found attention, found excuses. I know, he said again. Imani looked toward the house. Through the screen door, she could hear her family inside. Her mother laughing, somebody arguing over cards, music from the kitchen, life. Nathaniel looked at the house too, then back at her. There's something I've been carrying around for a year, he said quietly. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and slowly he pulled out the folded note. Nathaniel held the note carefully, like it might fall apart in his hands. The edges were worn now, soft from being folded and unfolded too many times. Imani stared at it. Don't forget your charger. You always forget your charger. For a second, she was back in that kitchen, standing barefoot in the dark before sunrise, still loving him, still thinking about him before she thought about herself. Nathaniel looked down at the note. I kept it. Imani swallowed. You shouldn't have. I know. The evening air felt cooler now. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. A car rolled slowly past the end of the street. Nathaniel looked at her. I think part of me thought, if I kept this... He stopped. I don't know. Maybe I thought it meant there was still a way back. Imani looked at him for a long moment. There was a time when those words would have undone her, a time when she would have mistaken being missed for being loved. But she knew the difference now. Slowly, she stepped closer. Nathaniel's face changed. For one impossible second, he looked hopeful. Imani reached out. Then she gently folded his fingers back over the note. You don't need to wait for me, she said softly. Nathaniel stared at her. Why not? Imani looked down at his hand, at the note, at the years between them. Because if you spend the rest of your life waiting for me, she said quietly, then you still won't learn anything. Nathaniel looked like he had been punched. I did learn. You learned what it feels like to lose me. Her voice stayed gentle. But you still think the answer is me coming back. Nathaniel opened his mouth, then closed it, because she was right. Part of him still believed that if she forgave him, if she came home, if she loved him one more time, then somehow he would be okay. Imani looked at him. Tears burned in her eyes, but her voice stayed steady. The last thing I ever want to do for you, she said softly, is teach you how to live without needing a woman to disappear so you can feel whole. Nathaniel looked down. The truth of it hurt, because it was true. All his life, he had needed someone to hold him up. His mother pretending everything was fine. Imani sacrificing pieces of herself to make him feel important. Vanessa making him feel admired. He had spent years taking from women and calling it love, and now, standing on the street where he grew up, he finally understood what love had actually asked of him: to see her, to choose her, to protect the person who had always protected him. He had failed. Nathaniel looked at Imani. His eyes were red. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Imani nodded. "I know," and somehow that made him cry harder. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just one man standing in the fading light with tears running down his face because the only woman he had ever truly loved had finally stopped loving him more than she loved herself. Imani stepped closer. Very gently, she kissed his cheek. A goodbye, a thank you, a funeral for the life they once thought they would have. Nathaniel closed his eyes. When he opened them, she was stepping back. "I really did love you," he said. Imani smiled sadly. "I know." Then she turned toward the house. Nathaniel watched her walk up the path, watched her climb the porch steps. For a second, she paused with her hand on the door. Then she looked back at him one last time, not with anger, not with regret, just with the quiet sadness of someone who had finally accepted that loving a person is not always enough to save them. Then she opened the door. Warm light spilled out onto the porch. He could hear her mother laughing in the kitchen, could hear somebody arguing over cards, Frankie Beverly playing softly from the radio. Life, real life, the life she came from, the life that had taught her how to love without pretending. Imani stepped inside. The door closed behind her. Nathaniel stayed where he was, alone on the sidewalk, the note still in his hand. For the first time in his life, he understood that love was never supposed to mean one person disappearing so the other could feel important. Love was supposed to make both people feel seen, and by the time he finally understood that, the woman who had spent 20 years trying to teach him was gone. If this story touched you, take a second and ask yourself one hard question. Have you ever been loving someone so much that you slowly stopped loving yourself? And if you have, what would it look like to finally choose yourself the way Imani did? Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe to Mr. Kingswell Stories for more unforgettable stories about love, betrayal, family, and the moments that change who we become.